Welcome to the Rebranding Christianity podcast, a space for those who care about Jesus' message of love, grace, and selflessness, but are concerned that contemporary American Christianity has, forgotten that. Or has missed the plot, maybe, or lost its way, gone off brand. However you want to say it, it's clear that what Jesus told his followers to be known for, radical love, a love that is reminiscent of the way Jesus has loved us, is not typically what Christians or Christianity is known for, at least not in America. Something has gone terribly wrong. It's time for Christians to have some serious conversations and to return to or begin to reclaim what Jesus intended Christianity to be. That's what Rebranding Christianity is all about. Hey there, I'm Greg Holmes.
And I'm Cindy Park. Joining us for this episode is Jeff Jones, who we talked to in episode 1, along with Mike Hogan. Jeff and Mike are two of the three authors of the book, Rebranding Christianity, When the World's Most Important Brand Loses Its Way. And that book launched this podcast. In our last episode, we heard about Jeff's backstory and his reasons for writing this book. Today, we want to get to know Mike. Jeff, I'd love for you to make the introductions.
I would love to do that. So Mike Hogan and I have known each other for probably 30 years now, serving together at Chase Oaks Church. Mike hates this kind of conversation of how crucial he's been in the whole movement of what's happened behind the scenes. But I got to know Mike a long time ago as a marketing executive and as a strategic thinker. One of the best strategic thinkers I've ever been around and a great leader, and has helped us be really clear about who we are, what we're trying to do, and how we are going about it, and how well on all kinds of efforts. And so, Mike, thanks so much for all that you've done over the years, including the opportunity to be involved in this book. And I know you don't like me to say that. Like, you're not going to remember this, but, or maybe you do remember this.
I'm sitting here we're all at the same table.
Yeah, because years ago,
watching Mike squirm.
He was so helpful, and I was, I think I took you out or something to thank you and all this, and you handed me a letter. Do you remember this?
I do.
And you asked me to put it in my desk, and that whenever I'm tempted to do that again, to read the letter. and what the letter said basically was, essentially, Jeff, you are the chief keeper of opportunity at Chase Oaks Church. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to be involved in whatever, in what we're involved in. And anytime you're tempted to thank me, just let me hear you
back to
say thank you for the opportunity. So anyway,
exactly.
So with all that, you've done a lot of cool stuff, and you're probably better to talk about it, probably more accurate if you talked about your background rather than me trying to do that. So tell us about your background a little bit.
Sure, thanks. So I actually grew up in St. Louis until maybe high school, and my family moved to suburban Chicago. When I was very little, like sort of preschool and maybe up to about age 7, my family was regular churchgoers. We were probably, not. This would have been in the late 60s, so we were nominal churchgoers. Sort of get dressed up and everything. I'm sure it was more of a social commitment than a spiritual commitment. And then, unfortunately, my parents divorced when I was quite young, and that was obviously a lot of change. And my brothers and I were living with my mom, and I think my mom quickly figured out that the church, at least that church in those days, didn't have a lot of use for a divorced woman, right? And my mom, she hadn't done anything wrong, but she was very, shamed and disrespected, and ultimately decided that, the church was not a place for her. So we ended up leaving and frankly never came back. Interestingly enough, my mom later remarried. This was when I was in 7th or 8th grade, and my stepdad was, you've heard this story a lot, he was one of those guys who'd grown up in the Catholic Church and kind of walked away as soon as he was old enough to make a decision for himself. So it's probably fair to say that our whole family was one that felt abused by the church and had no use for it. It wasn't really until college that I got exposed to what I would call a gospel message. It's interesting. Last week, I think Jeff told a story about being in Chicago on a trip and visiting this church called Willow Creek. So I'm graduating from high school, getting ready to go off to college, And my girlfriend at the time, who I should add is my wife now, and we're celebrating our 40th wedding anniversary this month, actually. So she invited me to church, which, interestingly enough, was this place called Willow Creek. And I remember thinking, well, this is a place that's worth listening to. Maybe there's something here for me. So that was, I had started with a really negative experience, but, God has a way of coming around, right? And so that's how I got to belief, and that's how I got into the church. On the professional side, pretty early in my career, I got into brand management at PepsiCo. PepsiCo was a really well-respected company, and it was a great place to learn about business and kind of prepare for a future in general management, which is what I thought I wanted to do. So it seemed like a good place to learn. At the time, this category, which people call consumer packaged goods, so think about like most of the brands that you would know would be called consumer packaged goods. It was sort of the epicenter of branding, and I had the opportunity there to learn from some of the really, really best people in the business, including, by the way, Dwight Jewson, who was a consultant working for Frito-Lay over the years. We can talk more about this when we get to the next chapter, but I realize that when you say a word like branding, it means different things to different people. Some pretty negative, some pretty positive. But when I say branding, I mean like branding done well. And to me, it's a noble profession. And again, more on that when we get to chapter 1. But over the years, I had the chance to build and manage some of the world's most powerful brands. From like Doritos and Pepsi to GameStop or Johnson & Johnson, Microsoft, big brands like that. Ultimately, I ended up running businesses, but I really spent my formative years in brand management, and I think that probably affects the way I view the world, right? So to me, branding, and we'll talk about this more later too, but branding is everywhere, and so I tend to see the world through this unique lens.
Yeah. Well, I would be interested. Thank you for telling us that, Mike. I've known you for several years, and there's a lot of that story I hadn't heard. I'd be interested to know, you guys, you two, Mike, you and Jeff have known each other for a long, long time. At what point did the conversation start to begin that we should write a book? Was it your idea? Was it Jeff's idea? What was the genesis of this book? And you two working together on it.
Well, the good news is I suppose you can ask us both the question, and you'll probably get 2 different answers,
or three,
yeah. But to me, I think Jeff may have told a story the last time about Dwight Jewson initially I had asked him if he'd come and work, do some work with me with Chase Oaks, and he was wondering whether it was even an ethical thing to do. But, once we sort of got past that, we ended up just sort of, serendipity. We ended up having these dinners, and there's this particular restaurant that we all really like, and we would meet there, I'm going to say once or twice a year for probably 6 or 7 years. And these sort of conversations grew, and in fact, my kids who were, by the end of this, were college age, they'd always be like, are you having a Jeff and Dwight dinner? Because that could be really interesting, because they knew I would always come back feeling, charged up and energized. But we talked about a lot of things, and I can remember one particular time I had sent this sermon that Jeff had given to Dwight, and one of the things that Jeff had said in the sermon was the belief that we in the church often use the power that we had for our own ends as opposed to using our power on behalf of the powerless. And, Dwight is a guy who's not a church-going guy, but very, very spiritual and very interested in making the world a better place, and frankly, a lot of things that we would call Christian values. And he happens to live, by the way, in Seattle, Washington, which is a really blue city in a really blue state. And we were having dinner, and he said, I was having dinner with some of my friends last week, and I told them this story, and they just looked at me like totally aghast. Like, no, it's not possible that a pastor of an evangelical church in Dallas, Texas, could even have said something like that, because they're just a bunch of angry bigots down there. This couldn't possibly happen. And I think that grew into this story about, there's a voice here, or there's a perspective that is, and Chase Oaks isn't the only example, it's just an example of it, right? But there's a voice there that I think, for most of the country, you would say this is never what they would hear when they see evangelical Christianity, whether it be somebody on TV or somebody in writing in a magazine or whatever. And so that began this long conversation about, how do you do this? And then that became, one of these conversations that we've all had about, we need to write a book someday, right? And we had this conversation for a long time. I think we were pretty serious about it. And then I remember about a little over a year ago, Jeff ended up taking a sabbatical for a couple of months and going off. And it was a very significant time for him. And when he got back, I'm not suggesting this was the first thing that he did when he got back, because I'm sure he kissed his wife hello and whatever. But he called me up and he's like, that book we've been talking about writing? I said, yeah. He goes, well, we actually have to write it. And so I think it started with him. I think it was this sense of urgency about what we're seeing. And sometimes you have these feelings, of if we don't do this, probably nobody else is going to do it. Yeah. So that's at least my recollection.
And I remember a moment, because we started, 7-8 years ago with these conversations with Mike, and at least my focus was more at the time, hey, how do we, in the Dallas area where we serve, and there's all these people outside of the faith who've been burned by church, who've been hurt by evangelical, who have a very dim, skeptical view. How do we change the perception of Christianity in our area? And I remember in one of those conversations, Dwight said, well, why are we just thinking about Dallas? Why isn't this a national conversation? Why isn't this, And we're thinking, well, because I'm in Dallas, but for people like Mike and Dwight who think these big marketing campaigns, and all this, why wouldn't you think that way? And wouldn't it give hope to the whole country? And this is a nationwide problem, and so that has certainly helped steer me at least that direction. And then we started thinking about some of these things, and I was dragging my feet, as I'd mentioned, on writing the book. So yeah, I was on sabbatical where I sensed God sort of kicked me in the rear to say, hey, this needs to happen. And of course, it was a delight to do it, not just me as a pastor, that's one voice, but to be able to have Mike, marketing expert and a Christian, and Dwight, a branding expert and a nun, N-O-N-E. It's just been a fascinating process. Yeah.
So, Mike, it makes sense that Jeff would want to write this book because he's a pastor and his job is directly tied to the church. Mm-hmm. But you're coming at it from a business sector, so why did you want to be a part of this book?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. I think for me, well, first of all, I mentioned I tend to see the world through the lens of branding anyway, right? And it's I suppose it's both a blessing and a curse. But like when I go to the grocery store, I see different things than most people, right? And I often ask myself the question, what is this brand telling me? And then, like a lot of people would say, is it compelling? Do I believe it? Do I actually think they mean what they're going to say? And so I just tend to think of things that way. But as we'll talk about probably in future episodes, there's a lot of things that I think of as brands that a lot of people don't think of as brands. So people are brands, religions are brands, and so on. And so as a Christian, I think about how Christians were perceived at the time I was growing up and I first came into the faith. And I think you would say, you might agree, you might disagree, but most people thought that Christians were pretty good people. They were honest, they were trustworthy, and whatever. And it's a little, I suppose there's a little bit of frog in the kettle here that you don't notice it day by day, but 30 years passes, and you realize that, when you turn on the TV or talk or something, we're kind of vilified. And I've had a number of people who've, said to me, in more or less direct way. People, let's say somebody that I get to know through a business context that lives in the Northeast, and we're up there, we get to know each other for a while, and then they find out, I'm a Christian or where I go to church, and they're like, well, that's surprising. And I'm like, why? And they said, well, because we thought you'd be, like an a-hole. and so for me, I think if I care about brands that I'm working on, whether it's a GameStop or a Microsoft, how much more should I care about the brand Christianity? Because I do believe it's the world's most important brand. And I spend most of my career observing these brands when they make good decisions and bad decisions. And I've seen some stories of great brands that have fallen by the wayside, that don't exist anymore. But I've also seen some stories of brands that had a problem, recognized they had a problem, and they were authentic and transparent and forthright enough about it to admit it and do something about it and turn it around. And so I think about, for the church, why in the world, we certainly don't like the path that things are going on. So I think there's a little bit like the same of writing the book, which is, if you don't say it, who's going to say it? And I do think it's a message that needs to be heard. And I do think, honestly, I think there's probably a lot of people in the church who don't necessarily want to hear this, but I think there's a whole lot of people outside the church who are kind of saying, look, dude, we already know there's a big problem. Right. The only question is whether you're going to admit it, whether you're going to own up to it or not. And so I think there's a need for that. So to me, hope is that this is, a voice of authenticity that can get some people's attention.
One thing I think is fascinating about this book, Jeff, and you and I have known each other for years, and you have displayed in your professional career, in your ministry, a willingness to, or an understanding that all truth is God's truth, and if there's something that we can learn from the business community, from marketing expert or whatever, it's like, why wouldn't we just learn from them? That I think sometimes within Christian leadership, there's kind of a, we wall off, like we have our own little experts, and sometimes we just make really dumb mistakes, that there's, that there are smarter people out there that have figured some things out, and your willingness to talk with Dwight and Mike and, around these issues that are their areas of expertise, I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, I was taught in seminary how to do things like parse Greek verbs.
Yeah.
Which has a very limited,
very practical skill in the 21st century.
What do you mean you're not using that every day?
So there's all these incredible, and I hope every pastor, but there's all these amazing people in church who have, God's given them a calling and a platform and training and all that, and do amazing things. And sometimes pastors just say, hey, if you could pass out bulletins or something, it's like, hey, these are incredible, so Mike has actually been on our executive team, the primary leadership team of our church since 20 years. And this is already going so well, I'm going to double your salary again.
Outstanding.
Because he is volunteer, it's easy to do that. But it's always so amazing to see people like Mike and others in any church, just bringing everything they have and all the training and background to God's kingdom and making it better.
Mike, you mentioned spending your career in brands and building brands and all this kind of stuff is kind of a blessing and a curse, and how you see maybe different things at the grocery store. I've often wondered if movie script writers, if they're ever able to enjoy a movie, because they know as soon as the gun is introduced at the 10-minute mark, it's going to go off at the 45-minute, or they know what's going to happen. Does kind of knowing how the sausage is made when you're watching commercials, I imagine you're not easily swayed by clever marketing.
Well, it's a great question, and I'll tell you a couple of stories here. One is, this is way back when my son Colin was probably 7 years old, and we're at home, and he's watching, some show, and this TV commercial comes on for something, and he comes up to me and he goes, Dad, is that true, or is that just marketing? And I looked and I said, I don't know. I think it probably might just be marketing. But, of course, I was a little bit offended by this, right? Because my job was running marketing for this large company. But, when I also, back in my PepsiCo days, I remember one year we actually sponsored a concert series with the singer Amy Grant. And so I spent a fair amount of time traveling with the producer and going to some of these shows. And it was really interesting because we're sitting together in the audience in this thing, and I realized, a third of the way through this concert, that we were having completely different experiences, right? I'm sitting there listening to the music, watching the show, and saying, "Hey, this is pretty good. I like this." He's looking at it through the eyes of a producer. So he's got this pad out, and he's writing down all these things. The lighting's off, so and so missed their cue, what's going on with the sound. So to your point, he's looking at it from a different perspective. And I think about this imagine going to a restaurant sometime. We used to go in there, but imagine going to a restaurant and then sitting there and saying, I wonder what this is like from the perspective of the restaurant manager. A bunch of people just came in, the kitchen's getting backed up. Did so-and-so wash his hands? All these kind of things you have to think about. So Yeah, it is a blessing and a curse, but I feel like it's kind of a behind the scenes look at things, and I have the experience a lot where, and this is even like with brands that I know and love. Maybe it's a favorite restaurant or a hotel chain or an airline or whatever, and you've always had these great experiences, and then you just notice little things, and you're immediately thinking like. Right, like I know that they're not sitting in the boardroom saying, "What can we do to possibly irritate people?" But whatever they're doing, it's not working.
Right.
And I tend to think, okay, well, I know where this is going. And then most of the time, you can kind of see the train wreck happening in slow motion, but there's nothing you can do about it. So yeah, I have that experience a lot. But to me, it's just, kind of an interesting perspective on life. And I suppose no matter what profession is, your profession is, we have another good friend who, very nice lady, and she worked for years and years at Home Depot. And every time she comes over to her house, she asks, how is our plumbing? And anytime we have like if we were to have a plumbing issue and we were not to call her to fix it, she would be offended. So she's actually a pretty good friend to have, So I guess we all have our own little window on the world.
So with that in mind, thinking about the fact that you do get a behind the scenes look, do you have a favorite brand message or favorite marketing campaign in all your years that you've been in this industry?
There's... it's kind of like saying, what's your favorite book or what's your favorite song? I could probably give you my top 10, but I don't know about one. And I think we all have some brands that we're really passionate about and that are meaningful to us, personally. I think for me, there's brands like Apple. This is not their current tagline, but for years, they had this tagline that was just think different. For me, it was a great experience of, I love the products, but it really said something about me. Like, I don't want to think like everybody else. I want to think different. Yeah. And they're helping me do that. Another favorite is BMW. I love the ultimate driving machine. And I always tell people, it's, it's not, people can like whatever kind of car they want, but like, what everybody else is talking about in the category is maybe it's luxurious or it's soft or whatever. No, it's the ultimate driving machine. If you like there's drivers and there's passengers. If you want to drive, this is the car for you. And then of course I've had a front seat to some real brand disasters over the years. It was in my early days at Frito-Lay. And this whole Coke-Pepsi war thing was going on, and that was when Coca-Cola changed their formula, and they lost all this market share.
So were you the guy? Was that you? Was that your fault?
keep in mind, I was working for Pepsi at the time.
Okay.
But the end of the story is really kind of interesting because what happened is, a little bit of a backstory here. So what happened was the marketing people determined that in blind taste tests, like at certain temps. So picture not a super cold product, but like warmish, like you might get it in the grocery store, in a little cup. A lot of people actually preferred the taste of Pepsi to the taste of Coke because it wasn't as strong, it was a little sweeter, and so on. So the marketing people at Coke said, well, okay, we're going to change our formula. And so they did this and they launched a new Coke. What they forgot was that the power of the brand wasn't just about this sort of blind taste, and people revolted and so on. They lost this market share, but within a month or so, they relaunched it. They called it what? Classic Coke, right? Mm-hmm. But the rest of the story is then for the next 10 years, Coke went on to literally annihilate Pepsi all around the world. And I mean, they gained so much market share after that. So it was a great example of a brand making a mistake, but then learning from it, acting quickly. And the end of the story, Roger Enrico wrote this book called The Other Guy Blinked. And I'm always like, yeah, it's the other guy blinked. And then he went out and just kicked my butt all over the world for the next 10 years. So.
Wow. All right. I want to ask a question that we're going to get to in more depth in a future episode. But I would like to, and it's a similar question that we asked Jeff in episode 1, and that is just about the title of the book. Because some people, I'm just assuming, projecting. Some people, I think, Christians, will feel a little bit iffy about whether or not it's okay to call Christianity a brand. That it seems much bigger than a brand. Is that irreverent to do, that kind of thing? And we're going to talk about what is and isn't a brand and, all that kind of stuff in a future episode. But I'd love for you, just as a Christian, also, just to briefly, why do you feel okay, calling Christianity a brand?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Greg. So, let me go back to, I realize that for some people, when you use the word branding or marketing, they think about the used car salesman. And I, that obviously happens. But when I say branding, I mean something else. And so what I would say to people who are maybe not offended, but iffy about the analogy, I'd say, number one, we mean it with the utmost respect. Right. And so I think as we go through this, we can talk about examples of brands that make really, really deep promises that are really important in people's lives. So this is really serious stuff. And if that's true, if you think that the promise that Apple Computer makes, or imagine the promise that some life-saving pharmaceutical is making to you, so really important stuff, in that case, Christianity as a brand, and remember, I look at the world through this lens, so I see brands everywhere, is in fact the world's most important brand. And so for me, I number one, I think we mean the comparison, the analogy with the greatest respect. Number two, the core of this analogy and sort of the angle of the book is that great brands make promises about things that are really important in people's life. Christianity is a brand that has made probably the most important promise that's the most important in people's lives could be. To continue the brand analogy, the question then is, okay, but do they keep the promise over time? Mm-hmm. And if I don't care whether the brand is, American Airlines or Heinz Ketchup or the Catholic Church or the Christian Church, if we don't keep the promise over time, then people will lose trust. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I've seen this happen in the branding world many times. I'm seeing it happen in the church world. And like Jeff said, we, as Christians, we should be known as the most loving people who are loving others as Jesus loved us. And unfortunately, that's not the case right now. So my hope is that, just like Jeff's going to use a lot of analogies in a sermon, right, to make a point. And I think a lot of times people find the story or the analogy very helpful. The hope is that there's this analogy will really help to communicate the core message here. But it intends nothing but respect for the brand.
So, Mike, you touched on this a little bit, but what are your hopes in contributing to this book?
Yeah. Well, so first, I think we just hope to engage people and to tell the story in an interesting way. Right. I'm sure there's other people talking about this. I think we're hopefully talking about it in a unique way. I think it's a message that needs to be said, and to a lot of people it's surprising. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I meet a lot of people who are no longer in the church, right? And they clearly see the problem. They're not, they're not mystified about what's going on. But I think what they are surprised is to hear a pastor or people who are in the church who are actually willing to talk about it, to admit that there's a problem and talk about it. And I hope that, just as people can relate to a brand that's lost its way but is trying to come back, they'll be energized to see the church gets back to its core focus. I do think that people are very cynical today. There's media saturation, but I also think people are very forgiving when you're transparent and authentic. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they don't expect perfection. They just hope for honesty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As I hear both of you guys talk about your reasons behind this book, and as I listen to you, Mike, kind of talk about what you've learned in brand management and how that relates to what we're going through, my hope, and after reading this book and talking with you guys, is that anyone listening, if anyone listening is kind of iffy about the whole concept of referring to Christianity as a brand, I just encourage anyone just to kind of treat this as a thought experiment. Whether you're fully bought in or not, let's just say Christianity is a brand, even for argument's sake, it's just a very big, important brand that makes some huge promises. And if that's the case, then just as you said, Mike, it brings up other questions then, like what does it mean for a brand to be successful? What does it mean for a brand to decline? What makes a good brand good? That's a very interesting question. And what measures do we look at? And what does it take for a brand to turn around once they decline and start losing market trust and all of those things? Lots of follow-up questions to the whole idea. If Christianity is a brand, then what do we do next? Well, we're going to get into that in the next episode of Rebranding Christianity, so come back and join us.